December 15, 1944. The Rocky Mountains of Colorado stood silent under a sky that promised violence. At Camp Snow Ridge, a makeshift prisoner of war facility nestled in a valley 8,000 feet above sea level, 43 German women auxiliaries were about to face something far more dangerous than any battle they had witnessed in Europe. They were about to face their first true American mountain winter. Johanna Richter pressed her face against the frosted window of the barracks, watching clouds roll over the peaks like a gray avalanche. At 26 years old, she had served as a communications specialist for the Wehrmacht, captured in France during the Allied advance. She had endured interrogations, the shame of surrender, and the long journey across the Atlantic to this remote Colorado facility. But nothing in her experience had prepared her for what the American Guards were calling the Big One. The camp had been established only 3 months earlier, converted from an old mining operation. The barracks were sturdy enough for autumn, but as December deepened, the inadequacy of the heating system became apparent. The coal-burning stoves struggled against the altitude and the brutal mountain cold that seeped through every gap in the wooden walls. Clara Vogel, a former nurse from Munich, sat on her bunk wrapping extra blankets around her shoulders. At 32, she was one of the older prisoners, and her practical nature made her a natural leader among the women. She had been watching the American Guards with growing concern. They moved with unusual urgency, reinforcing windows and stockpiling firewood with an intensity that suggested they knew something the prisoners did not. Lieutenant Miles Donovan, the camp supervisor, called an emergency assembly as the first snowflakes began to fall. The women gathered in the main hall, their breath visible in the already frigid air. Donovan was a career military man from Virginia, uncomfortable with both the mountain environment and the unusual responsibility of overseeing female prisoners. He stood before them with a telegram in his hand, his face grave. "Ladies," he began, his voice carrying the weight of genuine concern, "I've received weather reports from Denver. A major storm system is moving into our area. We're talking about temperatures dropping to 20 below zero, possibly colder with wind chill. Snow accumulation could reach 6 to 8 feet. The German women exchanged glances, many not fully understanding the numbers but grasping the severity in Donovan's tone. Johanna translated quietly for those whose English was weakest, and she felt her own stomach tighten with fear. 20 below zero. She had never experienced such cold. What Donovan did not tell them, what he had only learned an hour earlier, was that the camp's main heating system had developed a critical malfunction. The replacement parts were in Denver, and with the storm coming, no supplies would reach them for at least a week. They would have to survive on the small stoves in each barracks and whatever resourcefulness they could muster. Outside, the snow began to fall harder, and the wind started to howl through the valley like a living thing. The guards at Camp Snow Ridge were not typical soldiers. Most had been drafted late in the war, men deemed essential to their local communities until manpower shortages made their service necessary. They were ranchers, trappers, and prospectors who knew the Rocky Mountains the way sailors know the sea. They understood that mountains were beautiful and merciless in equal measure. Caleb Pritchard stood outside the guard station, studying the sky with the practiced eye of someone who had spent 34 winters in these mountains. Tall and lean, with weathered hands and a quiet manner, he had grown up in a cabin 20 miles north of the camp. His family had homesteaded this land for 3 generations, surviving winters that killed livestock and tested human endurance. When the draft notice came, he had reported for duty without complaint, but he had never expected to find himself responsible for the lives of German prisoners who knew nothing about mountain survival. Beside him, Owen McAllister pulled his coat tighter. Owen was younger, 28, from a ranching family in the neighboring valley. He had the broad shoulders and calloused hands of someone who had worked with animals and harsh weather his entire life. Unlike Caleb's quiet intensity, Owen possessed an easy warmth that made him popular among both guards and prisoners. "This is going to be bad, Caleb," Owen said, watching the snow begin to accumulate. "Real bad. Those women in there, they don't know what mountain cold feels like. European winters are nothing compared to this altitude." Caleb nodded slowly. He had been thinking the same thing since Donovan briefed the guard staff about the heating system failure. The lieutenant had ordered them to maintain standard security protocols, to keep proper distance between guards and prisoners. But Caleb knew that such rules were written by men who had never faced a Rocky Mountain blizzard at 8,000 feet. Garrett Sullivan emerged from the guard station, stomping snow from his boots. At 41, he was the oldest guard, a former mining engineer who knew these mountains from underground as well as above. He had a gruff exterior that concealed a fundamentally decent heart. "Donovan's playing this wrong," Garrett said bluntly. "He's treating this like a normal security situation. This isn't about keeping prisoners contained. This is about keeping people alive." The three men stood in silence for a moment, watching the storm intensify. They all understood what Garrett meant. In the mountains, there were no enemies, only survivors and casualties. The cold did not care about uniforms or nationalities. It killed with absolute impartiality. Inside the women's barracks, the temperature was already dropping noticeably. The small stoves glowed with coal, but their heat barely reached the far corners of the rooms. Johanna sat with Clara, Renate, and Ursula, the four women who had formed a close bond during their months of captivity. They spoke in hushed German, trying to maintain calm among the younger prisoners who were beginning to show signs of panic. "We need to organize ourselves," Clara said with her nurse's practicality. "We should pool our blankets, sleep closer together for warmth. We must treat this like a medical emergency, because that is what it will become if we are not careful." Johanna agreed, but she also watched the American guards through the window. She noticed how they moved differently than soldiers from warmer climates, how they seemed to understand something about this storm that terrified her more than their apparent confidence. By midnight, the temperature inside the barracks had dropped to 40 degrees. Outside, the thermometer read 15 below zero, and the storm showed no signs of weakening. The wind screamed through the valley with such force that the wooden buildings shook on their foundations. Snow drifted against the walls, climbing higher with each passing hour. Johanna lay awake, wrapped in every piece of clothing she owned, with 2 blankets pulled tight around her body. Still, she shivered uncontrollably. Around her, the other women huddled together on bunks, trying to share body heat. The small coal stove in the corner of the barracks glowed red, but its warmth seemed to evaporate before reaching them. Several of the younger women were crying softly, whether from cold or fear, Johanna could not tell. Clara moved between the bunks, checking on each woman with professional concern. Her medical training told her they were approaching dangerous territory. Hypothermia began subtly, with shivering and confusion, before progressing to something far worse. She had already noticed 2 of the younger prisoners showing early signs, their speech slurring, their movements becoming clumsy. In the guard station, Caleb sat forward suddenly, his instincts screaming alarm. He had been watching the temperature gauge drop steadily for hours. The heating system failure was worse than Donovan had admitted. At this rate, they would have casualties by morning. He stood abruptly, pulling on his heavy coat. "Where are you going?" Lieutenant Donovan asked sharply. "To check on the prisoners, sir. This cold will kill them. The security protocols state that night inspections require authorization and must be conducted by pairs with weapons ready." Caleb turned to face his commanding officer, his usually calm demeanor showing rare anger. "With respect, sir, your protocols were written for summer camps in Georgia. This is a Rocky Mountain blizzard. Those women are freezing to death while we follow procedures." Donovan bristled at the insubordination, but before he could respond, Owen stood, as well. "Caleb's right, Lieutenant. I've seen cattle freeze to death in conditions better than this. We need to act now." Garrett joined them, his gruff voice cutting through the tension. "My grandfather survived the winter of 1886 in a cabin with no heat. He taught me techniques that kept him alive. If we don't use that knowledge tonight, we'll be counting bodies in the morning." Donovan looked at the 3 mountain men, recognizing something in their eyes that his military training had not prepared him for. These men knew this environment in ways he never would. He thought of the telegram he would have to send to Washington if prisoners died under his watch due to cold. "What do you need?" he asked quietly. "Permission to teach them how to survive," Caleb replied. "Mountain style." Within 10 minutes, Caleb, Owen, and Garrett were moving through the snow toward the women's barracks, carrying supplies that had nothing to do with military protocol and everything to do with generations of hard-won survival knowledge. The barracks door burst open, bringing a blast of Arctic air and 3 snow-covered figures. The German women looked up in alarm as Caleb, Owen, and Garrett entered, their arms full of equipment that looked nothing like standard military issue. They carried axes, bundles of kindling, strips of bark, and what appeared to be dried moss wrapped in oilcloth. Johanna stood instinctively, positioning herself between the guards and the other women. Despite months of relatively humane treatment, the sight of men entering their barracks at night triggered old fears. But something in Caleb's face stopped her from speaking. His expression held no threat, only urgent determination. "We need to build proper fires," Caleb said, his breath visible in the frigid air. "The stoves aren't enough. You need to learn how to create heat from almost nothing, because that's what we have right now." Clara stepped forward, her practical nature overcoming caution. "Show us," she said in her accented English. Owen began clearing a space on the floor, while Garrett used his axe to split kindling into progressively smaller pieces. Caleb knelt down with the dried moss and bark, his movements deliberate and methodical. The women gathered around, drawn by curiosity and desperate need for warmth. "This is tinder fungus," Caleb explained, holding up the dried moss. "Grows on birch trees. My grandfather taught me to always carry some. It catches fire even when everything else is wet." He demonstrated how to shred it into fine strands, creating a nest of material so dry it seemed to drink the moisture from the air. Renate, a former administrative clerk from Berlin, watched with intense focus. She had always been quick to learn new systems, whether filing protocols or survival techniques. She knelt beside Caleb, studying his hands as they worked. Owen showed them how to arrange the kindling in a specific pattern, creating air channels that would feed oxygen to the flames. "Fire needs 3 things," he explained: fuel, heat, and air. Get the balance wrong, and you've got nothing but smoke and frustration. Garrett took over next, demonstrating how to use a knife and flint to create sparks. His scarred hands moved with practiced efficiency, striking the steel against stone until sparks showered onto the tinder nest. On the 3rd attempt, a tiny orange glow appeared. He bent close and blew gently, nursing the ember with his breath. The women leaned forward collectively, watching the small glow spread through the tinder. When the first flame appeared, several gasped. Garrett carefully transferred the burning nest to the kindling structure, and within moments, a proper fire blazed on the cleared floor space, its heat immediate and powerful. "Now you try," Caleb said, looking at Johanna. He handed her a piece of flint and a knife. "Your turn to make fire." Johanna's hands were shaking, whether from cold or nervousness she could not tell. But she took the tools and knelt beside the materials the mountain men had prepared. Johanna struck the flint against the steel blade, once, twice, 3 times. Sparks flew but missed the tinder nest. Her frozen fingers fumbled with the unfamiliar tools, and frustration welled up inside her. She had operated complex radio equipment under battlefield conditions, but this simple act of creating fire defeated her. "Slower," Caleb said quietly, kneeling beside her. "You're fighting it. Let the steel find the stone." He positioned her hands differently, adjusting her grip. His own hands were rough and warm, startling against her frozen fingers. On the 4th attempt, sparks landed directly in the tinder nest. A tiny ember glowed. Johanna bent close as she had seen Garrett do, blowing gently. The ember spread, grew brighter, and suddenly flame appeared. She transferred it quickly to the waiting kindling, and a second fire came to life. The women erupted in spontaneous applause, their pressable voices filling the barracks with something that had been absent for hours: hope. Clara immediately began organizing them into groups, assigning fire-tending responsibilities to ensure the flames would be maintained throughout the night. As the fires grew stronger, the temperature in the barracks began to rise noticeably. Women who had been huddled under blankets emerged, drawn to the warmth like moths to light. They arranged themselves in circles around the 2 fires, and for the first time since the storm began, the shivering subsided. Ursula Stein, the youngest of the prisoners at 19, sat close to one fire, holding her hands toward the flames. She had been crying earlier, homesick and terrified, but now her face showed wonder. "I never thought I would be grateful to learn American wilderness skills," she said in German. Johanna translated for the guards, and Owen smiled. "Mountains don't care what language you speak. Cold is cold in any tongue." As the night deepened, the rigid boundaries between guards and prisoners began to blur around the fires. Garrett showed Renat how to identify good firewood by its weight and sound. Owen taught Ursula how to bank a fire for slow, steady heat. Caleb sat with Clara, discussing the symptoms of hypothermia and frostbite, comparing her medical knowledge with his practical wilderness experience. The conversation gradually expanded beyond pure survival instruction. Renate asked about the mountains, how people lived in such harsh conditions. Garrett found himself talking about his grandfather's mining days, about winters when supply wagons could not get through and families survived on stored provisions and ingenuity. Clara shared stories of Bavarian winters, which seemed almost mild by comparison. She spoke of Christmas markets and frozen rivers where children skated. The other women added their own memories, creating a tapestry of experiences that reminded everyone in the barracks that beneath uniforms and nationalities, they all understood the basic human need for warmth and connection. Outside, the storm continued to rage with undiminished fury. But inside the barracks, around fires built by former enemies working together, something unexpected was beginning to grow. By dawn, the storm had transformed Camp Snow Ridge into an Arctic landscape. Snow had drifted 15 feet high against the northern walls, completely burying windows and blocking doors. The wind continued its relentless assault, driving the temperature down to 28 below zero. Inside the barracks, the fires that Caleb and his fellow mountain men had helped build were the only things standing between the prisoners and hypothermia. Lieutenant Donovan called an emergency meeting of all guard personnel at 0600 hours. The men gathered in the guard station, stamping snow from their boots and warming their hands on cups of weak coffee. The lieutenant's face showed the strain of a commander facing circumstances beyond his training. "Gentlemen, we have a serious situation," Donovan began, spreading a map on the table. "The heating system is completely offline. The storm has knocked out telephone lines to Denver. We're isolated, possibly for a week or more. I need to know our exact resource status." Garrett stepped forward. "We have enough coal for maybe 3 more days if we ration carefully. Firewood supplies are better, but we'll need to venture out to the storage shed, which is currently buried under 10 feet of snow." "What about the prisoners?" Donovan asked. "They survived the night because Caleb, Owen, and I taught them wilderness fire techniques," Garrett said bluntly, "but some of the men are uncomfortable with how much interaction that required." As if summoned by the comment, Corporal Hayes spoke up from the back of the room. Hayes was a by-the-book soldier from Philadelphia who viewed any deviation from protocol as weakness. "With respect, sir, we're fraternizing with enemy prisoners, teaching them survival skills, sitting with them around fires, sharing personal stories. This violates every regulation about prisoner management." Caleb turned to face Hayes, his usual calm demeanor showing an edge of steel. "Those regulations assume the prisoners are secure and healthy. Last night we had women showing signs of hypothermia. You want to tell their families back in Germany that we let them freeze because we were worried about fraternization?" "They're the enemy," Hayes insisted. "They served Hitler's regime. They're people caught in a blizzard," Owen interjected, "same as us. The mountain doesn't distinguish between American and German when it kills." The room divided along clear lines. The mountain men, Caleb, Owen, Garrett, and a few others with wilderness experience, stood on one side. The career soldiers and men from warmer climates stood on the other, uncomfortable with abandoning military protocol even in life-threatening conditions. Donovan listened to both sides, feeling the weight of command. He thought about his own daughter back in Virginia, only a few years younger than some of the German prisoners. He thought about the telegram he would have to send if anyone died. "Here's my decision," he said finally. "Survival takes priority over protocol. The mountain men will continue teaching survival techniques to any prisoner willing to learn, but we maintain security. No one leaves the compound." The second day of the storm brought a strange new routine to Camp Snow Ridge. While the blizzard continued to howl outside, inside the barracks a different kind of transformation was taking place. The German women, who had spent months in passive captivity, were now being trained in skills that their captors' grandparents had used to survive this unforgiving landscape. Caleb arrived at the women's barracks after breakfast carrying an armload of green pine branches. Johanna met him at the door, now serving as the unofficial liaison between the guards and prisoners. Her English had improved dramatically over recent months, and her natural leadership had emerged during the crisis. "What are these for?" she asked, eyeing the branches with curiosity. "Insulation," Caleb replied. "We're going to line the walls. Pine needles trap air, create a barrier against the cold. My grandmother did this every winter in their cabin." He demonstrated how to weave the branches between the wall boards, creating a dense green layer that immediately made the space feel warmer. Renate watched intently, her methodical mind cataloging each step. Within minutes, she was directing other women in the technique, organizing them into efficient teams. Her administrative skills, once used for Wehrmacht paperwork, now served a very different purpose. In another corner, Owen taught Clara and Ursula how to make emergency shelters using blankets and available materials. "If you're ever caught outside in a storm, you need to know how to create a windbreak quickly," he explained, showing them how to anchor fabric against furniture to form a protective cocoon. Your body heat trapped in a small space can mean the difference between life and death. Clara absorbed the information with professional interest, mentally adding it to her medical knowledge. She had already begun documenting the survival techniques in a small notebook, thinking that this information might prove valuable long after the storm ended. Garrett gathered a group of women around the main fire and taught them to read weather signs. "See how the smoke moves?" he said, pointing to the fire. "Tells you about air pressure, wind direction. My grandfather could predict storms 3 days out just by watching smoke and clouds." The women leaned in, their faces illuminated by firelight, completely engaged. These were the same faces that had shown defiance and fear when they first arrived at the camp. Now they showed determination and genuine curiosity. Not all the prisoners participated. A small group led by a woman named Hilda Kraus refused the lessons on principle, maintaining that accepting help from Americans was a betrayal. They sat apart, wrapped in their blankets and their pride, watching the others with disapproval. Johanna noticed the division, but chose not to force participation. She understood that survival was not just physical but psychological. Some women needed to maintain their sense of German identity and military discipline. Others, like herself, had begun to question what those identities truly meant. By afternoon, the barracks had been transformed into something resembling a mountain survival school. The third night of the storm brought an unexpected stillness. The wind died down to occasional gusts, and the relentless snowfall paused, leaving the world outside wrapped in deep silence. Inside the barracks, the fires burned steadily, maintained by women who now understood the rhythm of feeding flames. The temperature had stabilized at a survivable level, and with immediate crisis averted, something else emerged: the need for human connection. Caleb sat near one of the fires, checking the kindling supply. He had planned to return to the guard station, but Johanna gestured for him to stay. "Please," she said, "tell us about these mountains, how your family came to live here." He hesitated, uncomfortable with being the center of attention. But the faces around the fire showed genuine interest, and after months of treating these women as prisoners to be guarded rather than people to be known, he found himself wanting to share. "My grandfather came here in 1879, he began. "From Kentucky. He was running from something, never said what. Found this valley and decided to stay. Built a cabin with nothing but an axe and determination." He paused, staring into the flames. "First winter nearly killed him. He survived by learning from the Ute people who knew this land. They taught him which plants could sustain you, how to read the mountains' moods." Clara listened intently, then spoke. "My grandfather also survived a hard winter, 1918, after the First War ended. Germany was starving. He told me stories of eating bread made from sawdust, of watching neighbors die from cold and hunger." Her voice carried no bitterness, only memory. "He taught me that survival requires both strength and humility." Owen, sitting across the fire, added his own story. "My father lost his ranch in the drought of '36. Watched everything he built turn to dust. But he didn't give up. Started over with 3 cattle and determination. That's what mountain people do. We survive, we adapt, we rebuild. Renate surprised everyone by speaking up. She rarely shared personal information, preferring to observe. We have found. I joined the women's auxiliary because I wanted to matter, she said quietly. In Germany, women were expected to marry, have children, serve silently. The military offered purpose, importance. Now I wonder if I confused structure with meaning. The confession hung in the air, honest and vulnerable. Ursula reached over and squeezed Renate's hand. We all made choices we thought were right, the younger woman said. We cannot unmake them. We can only decide what comes next. Garrett pulled out a small harmonica from his pocket, an instrument he had carried since childhood. Without announcement, he began to play a simple folk melody. The tune was unfamiliar to the German women, but its melancholy beauty transcended language. Clara began humming along, finding harmony instinctively. Then others joined, creating a sound that filled the barracks with something none of them had experienced in months. Peace. March 18, 1945. The storm that had trapped Camp Snow Ridge for 6 days finally broke, leaving behind a transformed landscape of pristine white and crystal-clear skies. As the temperature climbed above freezing for the first time in weeks, the sound of melting snow dripping from roofs filled the air. Supply trucks from Denver finally reached the camp, bringing replacement parts for the heating system, fresh provisions, and a stack of official communications that would change everything. Lieutenant Donovan called Caleb, Owen, and Garrett into his office. His face showed the complicated emotions of a man who had been forced to confront the limitations of his training. The heating system will be operational by tomorrow, he said. Washington has sent new directives about prisoner management. We're expected to return to standard protocols immediately. Caleb felt something tighten in his chest. What does that mean exactly? It means no more joint survival training, no more informal gatherings. We return to proper guard prisoner separation. Donovan paused, looking uncomfortable. It also means preparing for repatriation. The war in Europe is winding down. These women will likely be sent back to Germany within months. In the women's barracks, similar conversations were taking place. Johanna sat with Clara, Renate, and Ursula, the 4 women who had become inseparable during the crisis. They spoke in German, their voices low and urgent. I do not want to return to Germany, Ursula said, her young face showing unusual resolve. Everything I believed about our country was a lie. Here, during the worst storm, Americans treated us like human beings. What awaits us at home? Clara, ever practical, voiced what they all feared. We will be seen as failures, captured soldiers who survived while others died. Worse, we now know what our country did, the camps, the atrocities. How do we return to a place that created such horror? Renate looked toward the window, where the mountains rose magnificent against the blue sky. These past months, learning from the mountain men, I felt purposeful in a way I never did serving the Reich. They taught us not just survival skills but a different way of seeing the world, cooperation instead of domination, respect instead of conquest. Johanna stood and walked to the window. The mountains that had nearly killed them now seemed beautiful, full of possibility. What if we asked to stay? She said quietly. Not as prisoners, but as people who want to learn a different way of living. The suggestion was radical, unprecedented. But as they sat in silence considering it, each woman felt the truth of it. They had survived the storm not through German military discipline, but through American mountain wisdom freely shared. They had discovered that enemies could become teachers, that survival depended on cooperation rather than conquest. Outside, Caleb stood in the melting snow, looking at the barracks where he had spent 6 days teaching women he was supposed to guard. He realized he did not want them to leave. 22 years after the storm that changed everything, Johanna Pritchard stood on the porch of a log cabin built by her husband's grandfather. The D. Americas, Rocky Mountains stretched before her, their peaks still snow-capped even in July. Behind her, inside the cabin, 3 children played with blocks on the floor while their father prepared dinner. Caleb moved through the kitchen with the same quiet competence he had shown that frozen night when he taught her to make fire from almost nothing. The decision to stay had not been simple. Of the 43 women imprisoned at Camp Snow Ridge, only 9 had formally requested to remain in America after the war ended. The process involved months of paperwork, sponsorships from local families, and intensive scrutiny from immigration officials suspicious of former enemy nationals. But the mountain communities that had witnessed their transformation during the blizzard advocated for them with surprising passion. Johanna had married Caleb in 1947, 2 years after the war ended. Their wedding in the small church in town had been attended by former guards and former prisoners alike, a gathering that local newspapers called a symbol of reconciliation. She had learned not just to survive in the mountains, but to thrive, working as a translator and cultural liaison for the growing number of European immigrants settling in Colorado. Clara had never married, choosing instead to dedicate herself to nursing in the mountain communities. She ran a small clinic where she combined German medical precision with American frontier practicality, treating ranchers and miners with equal skill. Her story had been featured in several medical journals as an example of how wartime enemies could become peacetime healers. Renate married Owen McAllister in 1948. Together, they ran a ranch that became known for its innovative techniques, blending German agricultural methods with Colorado ranching traditions. She often said that organizing cattle movements required the same systematic thinking she had once applied to Wehrmacht paperwork, but with far better results. Ursula, the youngest, had initially returned to Germany to search for her family. She found only ruins and graves. Within a year, she had returned to Colorado, sponsored by the same church group that had helped the others. She eventually became a teacher, educating a new generation of mountain children with a curriculum that emphasized cooperation over conflict. Not everyone approved. Some townspeople never fully accepted the German women, viewing them as enemies who had escaped proper justice. Old suspicions flared occasionally, especially when international tensions rose during the Cold War. But the women who had learned to make fire in a frozen barracks, who had survived through cooperation rather than conquest, proved resilient in the face of prejudice. As Johanna watched the sunset paint the mountains gold and crimson, she thought about that night when Caleb had placed flint and steel in her frozen hands. He had taught her more than fire-making. He had taught her that survival meant letting go of old identities and building new ones from nothing but determination and shared humanity.